Hi everyone, I'm Peter Cramp and welcome to my macro facts video for the summer 2026 exams. Before we get started, please allow me to share some exciting news with you. This year, we're making all of Economics Factory's top exam resources available to you through our student exam clubs. We think this is going to be the revision resource of the summer. Join one of our exam clubs now via the QR code on the screen, and you'll get access to a dedicated website giving you a model answer to every past paper question, practice papers and mark schemes on topics that seem due for testing, my revision guides, chains of analysis checklists, and an RSS feed from BBC Economics on every page. All this for the unbelievable price of just £69. Okay, ad over. Let's get started properly. Firstly, let's think a little bit about why learning data is so important. You can use data you've learned to show knowledge and application in your exam. Moreover, supporting evaluative judgments with key data is a habit of top-level students. If, for example, you know that the OBR has recently estimated the UK's output gap to be 0.8% of the economy's capacity, that's a negative output gap, in November 2025, you might use this as support for a judgment that there's some scope to cut interest rates, though above target inflation and events in the Middle East at the moment provide a counterpoint. There's going to be a lot of incredibly useful information coming up. Remember to take notes as you watch the video and to pause it when you need to. I need to say from the start that the picture for the UK macroeconomy is unusually uncertain at the moment. To understand why, we begin with a microeconomic graph for a single market, the market for oil. So on screen now, you can see the oil price over the last 5 years, and circled is the sharp rise in March 2026 due to the conflict of the USA and Israel with Iran. On the day I'm recording this video, oil prices have risen by 4% since 24 hours ago, and gas prices by as much as 20, even 25%. So how high will oil and gas prices be, and for how long? This is a really key question. We only have to look back to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 to get some idea of how damaging high commodity prices can be. The effects of higher commodity prices, including energy, are best modelled by a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. As firms experience increases in cost of production, they may pass on some or all of this increase to consumers in the form of high prices, so the impact is inflationary. But they may also produce less output, hitting economic growth. The combined effect can be stagflation, a combination of stagnating output with inflation. Now imagine you're in charge of setting interest rates. What might the effect be if you raise the base rate to combat inflation, which is the first obligation of the Monetary Policy Committee? And what might happen if you cut the base rate to support economic growth? As you can see, there's no good outcome here. So remember, as we go through the video, just how uncertain the macroeconomic picture is at the moment. This itself can be a useful evaluative point in exams. So we're going to have a tour of the 4 main macro indicators that we use to measure the performance of the economy, starting with GDP. And we start with bad news. The UK economy is barely growing. The graph on the screen shows us the monthly change to GDP over the past 2 years. And in 5 months of the past 12, GDP has actually fallen. In January 2026, there was zero economic growth. And so the overall picture really is one of sluggish economic growth. And it may not take much to push the UK economy into a recession, which is particularly concerning in the context of a crisis in the Middle East. This table brings us even worse news. The UK economy's long-run trend growth rate appears to have slowed. The average growth rate of the UK economy was once thought to be 2.5% a year or more, but the last 2 10-year periods have seen average annual growth of less than 2%. Moreover, if you extend the time period beyond that shown in the table, the UK economy has achieved growth of only a little over 1% a year ever since the financial crisis and the global recession of 2008 to 2009. So this begs the question whether the growth of around 1% is the UK's new normal, with all of the impact in constraining living standards that this implies. No wonder the current government talks of prioritising economic growth. Now, it's important to be clear about the difference between current short-run growth and long-run trend growth, and this diagram can help us with that. The economy's current growth at any time is largely accounted for by aggregate demand. For example, when aggregate demand grows, the economy is able to make use of any spare capacity, its output gap, to produce more goods and services. Derived demand for factors of production such as labour grows, unemployment falls, GDP increases, and the economy gets closer to its potential output. When AD falls, the opposite of this happens, and the economy shrinks and goes into recession. Thus, the business cycle sees GDP fluctuating around its trend as the level of AD changes. The long-run trend growth rate is determined by the rate at which the potential output, or the capacity of the economy, increases. And the economy's capacity is a function of the quantity and quality of land, labour, capital and enterprise available. So the fact that the UK is now achieving trend growth of only a little over 1% a year suggests that its capacity is increasing by just over 1% a year. And this slow rate of capacity increase is very much a cause for concern. In relation to this, it's important to remember that when the economy's capacity increases, it tends to have a beneficial impact on all four main macroeconomic indicators: GDP, unemployment, the rate of inflation, and the current account of the balance of payments. In this slide, we have some incredibly useful stats on GDP for you to remember. Believe me, the examiner will be impressed if you know the UK's per capita GDP when writing an essay about living standards, for instance. Very few students go into their macroeconomics exam knowing a recent estimate of the UK output gap, but it can be incredibly useful for evaluative purposes. So note that the OBR estimates the UK output gap to have been 0.8% of capacity in November 2025, indicating that the current GDP is not as high as potential GDP. The fact that the OBR forecasts GDP growth of 1.1% in 2026 tells us that the UK's poor growth performance seems set to continue, especially given that this forecast was made before the outbreak of conflict in the Middle East. It's really useful for you to know the composition of the UK's GDP too, and here perhaps you'll not be surprised, but the service sector now accounts for more than 80% of all of the output produced in the UK. So why has the UK's trend growth apparently slowed so markedly? We're going to look in turn at three possible explanations in the form of supply-side challenges facing the UK economy. And the first supply-side challenge is lack of investment. So the UK currently invests around 18% of its GDP, and this is lower than the other large developed economies in the G7, a group consisting of what used to be the 7 largest economies in the world. In fact, the UK has had the lowest investment in the G7 as a percentage of GDP in 24 of the past 30 years. Now, we'd perhaps expect investment as a percentage of GDP to be lower in developed economies than in emerging ones. So, for context, China typically invests around 40%, no less, of its GDP. But the UK's low rate of investment relative to key comparator nations in the G7 can only serve to constrain the quantity and quality of its capital stock, and hence its long-run aggregate supply and its trend growth. And another key concern is that the UK is likely to become less competitive against other economies over time as a result of this. Onwards to the second supply-side challenge for the UK, and this is low labour productivity. Remember that labour productivity is output per worker or output per hour worked. So UK labour productivity has grown very slowly indeed ever since the financial crisis. Indeed, output per hour now is only around 5% higher than it was back in 2007. This may be related to lack of investment, the first supply-side challenge we discussed, as when workers have more capital to work with, they tend to be more productive. Productivity is hugely important for trend growth and ultimately for living standards, so tackling the productivity problem is a priority for the government. It's worth noting that the UK has a persistent international productivity gap, with output per hour around 15 to 20% lower than in key comparator nations such as the USA. This suggests that production costs are likely to be lower in our competitor nations than they are here. We should say that it's not all doom and gloom. There are some signs of hope and rising productivity. For example, UK output per hour was 1.1% higher in Q3 2025 than it was a year earlier. Not only is labour productivity a cause for concern, but so too at the moment is labour supply. And this is the economist's third supply-side challenge. The UK's labour supply was hit by Brexit, so just before the Brexit referendum in 2016, EU net migration to the UK peaked at 280,000 people per year. Now things work the other way around. In the year to June 2025, there were 70,000 more people who left the UK to go to EU countries than came from them to the UK. So there are some labour shortages in the UK economy, and another reason for these is economic inactivity. Economic inactivity occurs when people of a working age are neither in work nor actively seeking it. And the UK's inactivity rate stood at 20.8% in the final quarter of last year. It's higher than it was before the pandemic, uniquely amongst the G7 countries. And that inactivity rate has increased most amongst 50 to 64-year-olds, and long-term sickness or disability is the most common reason for them not being able to work. But inactivity, of course, also affects other age demographics, notably young people between the ages of 16 and 24. There are now almost 1 million, or 1 in 8, people in this age group who are NEET, meaning that they are not in employment, education, or training. And I think this is a possible exam topic for macro this summer, so more to come on this later. It's useful to know that labour shortages are constraining output in some sectors of the UK economy. IT is a notable example, and we've got shortages of HGV drivers as well. That's causing a few problems with supply chains for the UK economy. There is increasing slack at the moment, so there's higher unemployment. It's getting a little easier for firms to find the workers they need. But it remains true that a limited supply of labour is still proving a significant constraint on the economist's capacity or long-run aggregate supply. Looked at the long-term supply-side challenges facing the UK. Let's cover aggregate demand. To conclude, I'll look at the factors affecting GDP. It's helpful to know that AD in the UK is very consumption-led, with household spending accounting for around 60% of all expenditure. Many observers believe that demand in the UK is too dependent on consumption, and that it would be better if investment and export demand played a bigger role. From this perspective, a rebalancing of aggregate demand is needed. At the moment, AD in the UK is being propped up by a low savings ratio, which in 2025 Q3 was only 9.5% of disposable income. Falling interest rates have also been supporting AD over the past 12 months or so, but there are concerns that rates may not be able to fall quickly, as this would risk inflation rising, and this is especially true now in the context of a crisis in the Middle East. AD is also being added to by the government, which spends more than it takes out of the economy and tax revenue. So we've got a persistent budget deficit. But how long can the economy keep relying on consumer spending and the government running a budget deficit in order to support AD? This is a key question. Okay, we've covered a lot there on GDP. Probably time for a quick break. Feel free to pause the video, go and grab a coffee, come back, we'll look at the other indicators in a few moments. While you're doing that, please remember our Exam Club websites, dedicated websites offering so much to you for your revision this summer. You can find them using the QR code on the screen. Hi everyone, welcome back, and we now move on to unemployment. Falling unemployment has been a good news story for the UK in recent decades. Although it has risen a little since, in August 2022, unemployment reached a near 50-year low of 3.5%. Moreover, the trend of unemployment has been downwards. We can see this in the graph, which shows unemployment peaking at a lower rate in each successive recession. It's no surprise, of course, that unemployment rises during a recession when there will be a lack of derived demand for labour, and therefore Keynesian unemployment. But the fact that unemployment peaks at a lower rate in each recession and is showing a downwards trend suggests that there's been less unemployment of other types over time. It also shows us that the natural rate of unemployment has fallen. Remember, the natural rate can be seen as the rate of unemployment when there is no demand deficiency, or the rate of unemployment when the labour market is in equilibrium, so that only structural and frictional unemployment remain. From this perspective, the UK has achieved long-term reductions in its unemployment rate, which may be associated with a labour force which is flexible and better able to meet the needs of firms. The long-term reduction in unemployment is a major plus, given the negative effects that unemployment may have on the living standards of those it affects and their families. We need to remember, however, that unemployment has risen over the past couple of years to stand at 5.2% in the 3 months to January 2026. More useful data related to labour supply and unemployment here. There are still skills shortages affecting firms in some sectors, but this is perhaps a problem that has moderated somewhat in the past couple of years. And this is reflected in the fact that the number of unfilled vacancies has fallen. And there's also a slowing pace of wage increases. It's worth knowing that wages are currently growing faster in the public government sector than the private sector. But the moderating pace of wage increases is one factor that may help to bring down inflation, notwithstanding that events in the Middle East may prevent this from happening. So now we turn to inflation, where the cost of living crisis has arguably been the biggest economics news story of the past few years. In 2022, inflation got significantly out of control, reaching 11.1% in October of that year, which is more than 5 times its target rate of 2%. It's important to understand that this inflation was largely of a cost-push nature. Soaring food and energy prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine were partly responsible for the inflation. It's no surprise that at the same time as this inflation, the UK experienced stagnating output, with GDP barely growing and sometimes falling. However, there may also have been some element of demand pull in the high inflation that the UK experienced. It's worth noting that the UK had already experienced above-target inflation before the war in Ukraine even started. And there may have been some UK-specific factors in the inflation, which is also suggested by the fact that inflation peaked at a higher rate in the UK than most other developed economies. One thing that may have been going on is that consumer spending, as the economy came out of COVID lockdown, combined with the UK's limited economic capacity to put upward pressure on prices. Inflation was brought back under control through interest rate increases to constrain aggregate demand. But there are question marks over whether it's yet been conquered. And in January 2026, at 3%, inflation remained at the upper end of the acceptable range of 1 to 3%, which is centred on its 2% target. And concerns over where inflation is going next may be heightened by the fact that core inflation, which strips out volatile prices such as those of food and energy, is still high. That's running at 3%. And of course, we've got that background factor of what's going on in the Middle East. And the Bank of England has said in March 2026 that it thinks inflation is probably going to head towards 3.5% over the coming months due to that crisis. But of course, it could go higher than that. And it could stay high for longer than we expect. It just depends on how high oil and gas prices are and how long they continue to be high. We now turn to the UK's trade position to complete our look at the four main macro indicators or objectives. The UK has a persistent trade deficit, which means we import a higher value of goods and services than we export. And this is largely caused by a huge deficit in trade in goods, which is not as great as our surplus in trade in services. Now, in general terms, a deficit for any country is more likely when its economy is booming, because higher expenditure by households and firms will include higher spending on imports. But the UK's deficit is what's known as a structural deficit. It's one which is there at all stages of a business cycle and may, for that reason, be more concerning. In recent data, the UK's current account deficit, which includes not just the balance of trade, but cross-border flows of interest, profit and dividends, primary income, and transfers, secondary income, was 1.6% of GDP. It's likely that the UK has got a fundamental problem with competitiveness, which is associated with the supply-side challenges we covered earlier in this video. And it's particularly important for competitiveness to look at factors that affect production costs. So the UK has relatively high unit labour costs, the average labour costs of each unit of output produced. And this is associated with the fact that we're a high wage economy and that labour productivity is lower than in comparator nations. Further, the UK's national minimum wage has risen in real terms over time, although it does remain only in the mid to upper range of minimum wages internationally. In terms of education, which affects competitiveness through the skills and qualifications of a workforce, its human capital, the UK is ranked 14th in the PISA rankings, which compare education internationally. We'll now have a quick look at the UK's pattern of trade, which refers to how much we trade, who with, and in which products. And of course, the UK is well known for having a comparative advantage in financial services. This is reflected in the fact that we're the world's largest net exporter of financial services, with net exports of $127 billion in 2024. Turning from services to look at goods, our biggest export is cars. Interestingly, the UK's biggest goods import is also cars. This shows how international trade brings us immense choice, with UK consumers able to choose between a number of brands of car made in the UK and many more internationally. The UK is also strong in medical drugs and is a major exporter in this sector. China is our top trading partner for imports, with UK consumers buying many goods manufactured there. And for exports, the USA is our biggest market. The infographic on screen shows that we export roughly 3 times as much to the USA as we do to Germany, which is our second largest export market. Unsurprisingly, Brexit has reduced trade between the UK and EU countries. The OBR suggests that in the long run, both imports from and exports to the EU will be about 15% lower than they would have been if the UK had remained in the EU. Since Brexit, the UK has had the freedom to negotiate new trade deals with countries outside of the EU, and to date, deals have been signed with a number of countries, such as Australia and New Zealand, but the impact of these seems small. A potential trade deal with the US would be much bigger news, but activity in this area seems limited currently to reducing the extent of Donald Trump's tariffs. So time for another quick break. Go and get yourself another coffee if you need one, and we'll be moving on to macro policy in just a few moments. Welcome back, everyone. So onwards to macro policy. We're going to discuss both the demand side and the supply side with respect to policy. And it's helpful to think of the role of demand side policy as smoothing out fluctuations in the business cycle. Meanwhile, the job of supply side policy is to boost the rate at which the economy's capacity grows and to deliver faster trend growth. So we look first at fiscal policy, which covers government spending and taxation. The UK has a budget deficit at the moment, which means that injections into the circular flow of income in the form of government spending exceed leakages in the form of taxation. Now, this budget deficit is a structural budget deficit. The deficit tends to be smaller when the economy is booming because this leads to higher taxation revenue and lower benefit payments, and the deficit grows during a recession. But the significant thing here is that the deficit is present at all stages of a business cycle. This is apparent from the fact that it's now 25 years since the UK last ran a budget surplus, which was in 2000 to 2001. One of the reasons that the budget deficit is important is that when government spending exceeds taxation revenue, the government must borrow to bridge the gap, and thus the national debt increases. The national debt is the combined sum of all past deficits and surpluses. So the UK's national debt is now approximately 100% of GDP, meaning that the government would have to seize all of the output produced in the economy for a whole year to pay it back. This creates concerns about the sustainability of the national debt. Might it grow to the point where it's difficult for the government to find new sources of borrowing? Whereas of this kind lead to the interest rate that the government has to pay when it borrows rising. And this in turn may put upwards pressure on interest rates across the economy, which is one reason why crowding out may occur. Crowding out sees growth of the government sector leading to shrinkage of the private sector. This may happen because government borrowing puts upward pressure on interest rates, making it more expensive for private firms to borrow to invest. In contrast, though, some observers believe that government spending crowds in the private sector. For example, spending on infrastructure may make it easier for firms to transport goods and for labour to move between areas of the country. This may boost private sector activity. The size of the national debt, combined with a proportion of government spending accounted for by the welfare bill, have led to benefit reform being a major focus currently. This also helps to make the hugely important point that fiscal policy affects the supply side of the economy as well as the demand side, and that's a fact often overlooked in exam essays. So always think about, can I get something in about the demand side and the supply side? On the supply side, for example, both the benefits and taxation systems affect incentives to work. Fiscal policy can also be used to shape the pattern of output, for example, by discouraging the consumption of demerit goods, such as alcohol. We'll finish our look at fiscal policy by looking at a selection of key indicators. Note that the budget deficit is expected to be 4.5% of GDP in 2025 to 26, despite attempts to constrain it, and that the deficit is expected to continue over the next few years. The multiplier effect of the net injection that the government is providing is likely to be fairly small, and this is because the UK has a high marginal propensity to import, so that a large proportion of income received leaks out of a circular flow at each stage rather than coming around again to create jobs and income for others. Now, never believe anyone who tells you that they know what the value of the UK's multiplier is. It can only ever be estimated. But it may be helpful to know that typical estimates are in the range from about 1.4 to 1.7, something of that magnitude. The fact that the UK has a negative output gap at the moment, albeit not a huge one, means that it may be able to accommodate higher AD without it adding too much to inflation, which is, of course, currently above target anyway. Moving on to monetary policy. The MPC raised interest rates at 14 successive meetings from a record low of 0.1% up to 5.25% in order to bring the 2022-23 outbreak of inflation under control. Their willingness to constrain AD, even though the inflation problem was widely perceived to be a supply-side issue, highlights their determination to bring inflation down. The Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, said at the time there would be no ifs and no buts in the fight against inflation. It's so important that it's credible that inflation will be low, because this helps to anchor inflationary expectations. You see, if high inflation is experienced and comes to be expected, this is likely to show in high wage settlements, which may give rise to another round of inflation and possibly a wage price spiral. And this is especially likely when workers are in a strong bargaining position over wages, which arguably in 2022 they were. I think that's perhaps changed a little bit with the rising unemployment over the last couple of years. But nevertheless, the experience of high inflation and expectations of inflation rising is not something that we want to see in the UK economy. And of course, that's a concern, with inflation still remaining at 3% at the moment and probably going to rise a bit this year. What we have seen as inflation came back, at least partially under control after 2022-23, is that interest rates have come down and they're now at 3.75%. But I think further cuts in the near future are now unlikely in the light of what's going on in the Middle East. It's also useful to know about other features of monetary policy. Quantitative easing, QE, which was used to boost the economy in the wake of the financial crisis and during COVID, is now being reversed in a process sometimes known as quantitative tightening. This is appropriate given recent concerns over inflation. The exchange rate is also part of our monetary position, and the pound has weakened over recent years, which supports the competitiveness of UK products and international trade, but may also be a source of cost-push inflation. Turning now to supply-side policy, we find that it takes centre stage as the UK tries to find ways to boost its trend growth rate. Interventionist supply-side policies include the government's promise to raise public sector investment to 2.6% of GDP. Meanwhile, the government has introduced a jobs guarantee for 18 to 24-year-olds who have been unemployed for more than 6 months, and the government will subsidise wages when firms take on these workers. The jobs guarantee is part of the government's response to the growing problem of NEETs, affecting those who are not in employment, education or training. The idea, according to the Department for Work and Pensions, is that young people will have work and training rather than a pathway into economic inactivity. The nearly 1 million young people in this category are affected either by unemployment, looking for a job at current wage rates but without one, or inactivity, in which case they're not seeking work. And the proportion of young NEETs, 1 in 8 people aged 16 to 24, is much higher in the UK than in some other countries. In the Netherlands, for example, it is just 1 in 20. So responding to the issue of NEETs is clearly a priority in order to grow the UK's economic capacity. Not only does inactivity mean that people are not available for work who might be, the issue of NEETs acts as a constraint on future capacity too, as periods of unemployment and inactivity prevent workers from acquiring skills and experience which would boost their human capital and the economy's potential output. For young NEETs, the experience at this crucial stage of their lives may permanently reduce their earnings potential. Related to the issue of NEETs is the wider problem that the UK now has well over 5 million people of a working age who receive out-of-work benefits. Now, this isn't just job seekers' allowance, it also includes other benefits related to incapacity and sickness. So, about a year ago, in March 2025, the government announced plans to constrain out-of-work benefits, and the idea behind it was that this would improve incentives to work and boost labour supply. And although the government later had to water down these plans due to objections in Parliament, we can see benefit reform as a market-based supply-side policy. At the moment, one of the things that was just seen with benefits is that in the November 2025 budget, the government actually announced some benefit increases, not least by scrapping the 2-child benefit cap. We're just about there. We've got some really important final revision tips coming up for you on the next slide. But please do just take a moment with the information about our exam clubs, the revision resource of the summer. You can get them for AQA and also the Edexcel A specification, all the resources on a dedicated website. You know the drill, QR code on the screen now if you'd like to take a look at that. Well done, everyone. Thanks for being with me for this video. By working with it, you've taken some important steps towards exam success. But my last piece of advice is hugely important. You must do as much past paper practice under timed conditions as you possibly can. This is the only way that you'll know you actually can do it when you get into the exam room. Remember to use the key facts in this video and sprinkle them through your answer to show knowledge and application and to support evaluative judgments. Remember also to ask your teacher to mark your essays and give you feedback. Use the feedback, take it forward to your next answer in order to continually improve. So thanks to you all for watching and the very best of luck with your exams this summer.